The young and the restless spoilers. Under the surface of Genoa City, where power has always shifted not with explosions but with patience, silence, and calculated restraint, Victor Newman's public concession of defeat was never what it appeared to be. To the outside world, Victor stood tall and accepted loss with a composure that suggested age had finally dulled his legendary appetite for control. His words were measured, his demeanor calm, almost reflective, as if he had reached a rare moment of humility. But those closest to him, those who had survived decades of his wars, understood that Victor Newman had never confused surrender with acceptance. What he offered was not capitulation but camouflage. Even as Cane and Phyllis basked in their perceived victory, convinced they had outmaneuvered a titan and inherited the spoils of Newman Enterprises, Victor had already begun the slow, meticulous work of building something far more dangerous than open retaliation. He knew that true power was not reclaimed through spectacle, but through erosion, through time, through pressure applied so subtly that no one could trace the source until it was too late. Behind closed doors and far from Genoa City's watchful eyes, Victor began redirecting assets with surgical precision. Long-standing holdings were quietly restructured, shell corporations established in jurisdictions designed to obscure ownership and intent. Money moved not in panicked bursts but in carefully timed currents, flowing through international channels that only Victor's most trusted contacts even knew existed. These were not impulsive decisions born of wounded pride, but the culmination of decades spent learning how financial empires truly fall. Victor understood markets the way generals understand terrain. He did not need to attack Newman Enterprises directly. He merely needed to weaken the ground beneath it, to destabilize confidence, to let uncertainty do the damage that force never could. Every move was designed to leave no fingerprints, no clear enemy, only a growing sense that something fundamental within the company was decaying. Cane and Phyllis, flush with authority and intoxicated by the symbolism of their rise, mistook silence for submission. They believed that Victor's lack of visible resistance confirmed their triumph, and they settled into their leadership with an arrogance that came not from experience but from relief. They focused on short-term optics, bold public strategies, and internal restructuring meant to signal a new era. What they failed to grasp was that Victor was no longer playing their game. While they announced initiatives and reshaped the executive hierarchy, Victor watched from afar, gauging their weaknesses, exploiting their assumptions. His methods were invisible by design. Strategic investments made by third parties quietly undercut Newman's market confidence. Longtime allies began to withdraw support, citing vague concerns about stability. Contracts that once would have been renewed without question suddenly stalled. No single event was alarming enough to provoke panic, but together they formed a pattern that slowly bled value from the company. At the heart of this shadow campaign was Victor's greatest advantage, his network. Years of favors traded, loyalties earned, and secrets shared had created an infrastructure of influence that extended far beyond Newman Enterprises. Executives who owed Victor their careers, financiers who trusted his instincts over public data, and intermediaries who understood his language of quiet leverage all played their part without ever needing to see the full picture. Victor did not issue commands, he posed questions, made observations, allowed others to draw conclusions that served his purpose. In doing so, he insulated himself from direct blame while ensuring that the pressure on Newman Enterprises intensified with each passing week. The company's stock wavered. Analysts struggled to explain inconsistencies. Confidence eroded not because of scandal, but because certainty had vanished. Nikki, initially devastated by Victor's apparent defeat, found herself caught between grief and fear. She had seen him lose before, but never like this. His calm unsettled her. His silence frightened her. For a time, she believed he had chosen a reckless public strategy that risked destroying what remained of his legacy, and she questioned whether his pride had finally become self-destructive. Yet as she observed the subtle shifts occurring around Newman Enterprises, Nikki began to recognize a familiar pattern beneath the surface chaos. Conversations ended too abruptly. Information surfaced at moments that felt orchestrated rather than accidental. People who once dismissed Victor as finished suddenly grew cautious, hesitant, watchful. Slowly, the truth emerged not through confession but through recognition. Victor was not fighting loudly because he was winning quietly. Once Nikki understood the scope of his plan, she made a choice that would redefine her role not as a spectator to Victor's wars but as a participant in them. She stepped into the shadows alongside him, using her own relationships and intuition to gather information that could never be accessed through formal channels. Nikki applied pressure where it would not be noticed, influencing perceptions rather than decisions, planting doubts rather than issuing threats. She became a mirror to Victor's methods, subtle and precise, operating under the guise of concern and loyalty to the company rather than opposition. Together, they formed a silent axis of control, destabilizing Newman Enterprises from angles Cane and Phyllis never thought to guard against. As weeks passed, the consequences of this invisible war became impossible to ignore. Newman Enterprises began to feel unsteady, not in dramatic collapse but in persistent instability. Revenue projections faltered, strategic partnerships dissolved without explanation. Investors demanded reassurances that Cane and Phyllis could not convincingly provide because they did not understand the true nature of the threat. Every attempt to stabilize the company only seemed to expose another vulnerability. Phyllis grew increasingly frustrated, convinced that sabotage was at play yet unable to identify the saboteur. Cane, driven by pride and denial, insisted the problems were temporary, refusing to acknowledge that the foundation itself was being undermined. The brilliance of Victor's strategy lay in its restraint. He did not rush toward victory, nor did he reveal his presence prematurely. He allowed Cane and Phyllis to exhaust themselves chasing symptoms rather than causes, to alienate allies through desperation, to make mistakes born of confusion rather than malice. Each misstep accelerated the decline, validating the doubts Victor had so carefully seeded. Nikki watched this unraveling with a mixture of resolve and sorrow, fully aware that reclaiming control would come at a cost, but equally certain that allowing Newman Enterprises to crumble under an experienced leadership would cost far more. As the balance tipped further and the company's instability deepened, Victor prepared for the final phase of his campaign. The moment of reemergence would not be framed as revenge but as necessity. He would not return as a conqueror, but as a savior, the only figure capable of restoring order to a system teetering on collapse. When he finally chose to step back into the light, it would be with evidence, alliances, and leverage so overwhelming that resistance would be futile. Cane and Phyllis would realize too late that they had never truly defeated Victor Newman. They had merely inherited the illusion of power while he rewrote the rules beneath their feet. The quiet war would end not with a dramatic explosion, but with the unmistakable certainty that control had always belonged to the man patient enough to wait for the right moment to claim it. The air in the private study at the Newman ranch was stale, smelling of old leather and unspent rage. Adam Newman swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes tracking his brother, Nick, who was pacing the length of the Persian rug like a caged tiger. "He's sloppy, Nick. That's his problem," Adam said, his voice low, a velvet trap. "Cane thinks that just because he and Phyllis managed to hostile take over the company with that AI stunt, he's untouchable. But he forgot one thing. You don't stab a man like Damian Grimaldi and expect the ghost to stay buried." Nick stopped pacing, the shadows under his eyes remnants of his recent struggles with pain management and the stress of the family's ouster made him look dangerous. "The police report was buried. Self-defense, they said. But we both know Damian doesn't put himself in a position to be stabbed unless he's provoking it, or unless Cane lost control." "Exactly." Adam leaned forward, placing his glass on the heavy oak desk that once belonged to their father. "I've got a contact at the GCPD who says the ballistics and the angle of the wound don't match Cane's story. It wasn't a struggle. It was an execution attempt that failed. Damian is alive, barely, in a private clinic in Zurich. If we leverage this, if we prove Cane is a violent liability, we don't just get him arrested," Nick finished, a cold smile touching his lips. "We strip him of everything. Newman Enterprises, his reputation, Phyllis. Phyllis is the collateral damage I'm most looking forward to," Adam mused. "Let's get to work." The glass walls of the CEO's office at Newman Enterprises, currently occupied by Cane Ashby, offered a panoramic view of Genoa City, a kingdom he was desperately trying to rule. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Nick sat in a dimly lit corner of the Newman media server room, miles away from the executive suite physically, but digitally right inside Cane's top drawer. He wasn't supposed to have access. Cane had revoked all Newman family credentials weeks ago, but Nick knew the architecture of this system better than the architects. He had built half of it. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the new security protocols Phyllis had arrogantly installed. There. Got you, Nick whispered. The files were encrypted, but the metadata was damning. Transfers. Cell companies set up in the Cayman Islands under the name Ashby Industries. Cane wasn't just running Newman. He was siphoning funds to cover legal fees for the Damien incident and paying off witnesses. There were unauthorized liquidations of Newman subsidiaries' legacy projects Victor had built decades ago, sold for pennies on the dollar to quick cash vendors. It was embezzlement, plain and simple, dressed up as corporate restructuring. Cane was panicked, bleeding cash to keep his secrets, and he was using Victor Newman's money to do it. The Genoa City Athletic Club was buzzing with the lunch rush. Silverware clinked against china, masking the venomous whispers circulating at the corner table. Adam sat opposite three former Newman board members, men and women who had been unceremoniously dumped when Cane and Phyllis took over. It's not just about the stock price, Adam said smoothly, leaning in. He looked every bit the concerned legacy heir. It's about stability. You've heard the rumors about Grimaldi. A stabbing in an alley behind the underground. Is that the kind of temperament you want controlling a global conglomerate? Mrs. Vanderhoven, a matriarch of the board for 20 years, clutched her pearls. I thought that was just tabloid trash. Adam, surely Cane isn't violent, Adam cut in, raising an eyebrow. He's under immense pressure. And Phyllis, she's feeding his paranoia. I've heard from internal sources that Cane is liquidating assets not for strategy, but for survival. He's paying off blackmailers. How long before the SEC knocks on the door? And when they do you want your names attached to his sinking ship? He let the question hang there, watching the doubt bloom in their eyes like black ink in water. He was planting seeds of insurrection, and the soil was fertile. Phyllis Summers stormed into the CEO's office, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Her signature fiery hair was in disarray, her eyes wild. Have you seen the GC buzz? She hissed, throwing a tablet onto Cane's desk. Cane looked up, his face pale, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. I'm trying to work, Phyllis. The quarterly report is due. Forget the report, Phyllis shouted. Look at the headlines. Ashby's violent past resurfaces. Is the Newman CEO a criminal? They're coming for us, Cane. Someone is leaking the Damien story. It was self-defense, Cane muttered, rubbing his temples. I told you. He came at me. And the public doesn't care about the truth. They care about the narrative. Phyllis paced the room, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. And I'm getting dragged into it. They're saying I'm the Lady Macbeth behind a mad king. Victor is behind this. Or Adam. It's just noise, Cane tried to reassure her, but his voice wavered. It's not noise when advertisers start pulling out, Phyllis snapped. I just got a call from the Fenmore account. They're pausing their contract. They don't want to be associated with a CEO who might be indicted for attempted murder. You need to fix this, Cane. Now. The press conference was impromptu, held on the steps of the Newman Tower. Nick Newman stood before a phalanx of microphones, the wind whipping his coat around him. He looked every inch the grieved son, the rightful heir stepping up to defend his family's legacy. I didn't want to do this, Nick began, his voice grave, projected to the millions watching at home. But I cannot stand by and watch my father's company be dismantled by a man who has no respect for the law or ethical business practices. He held up a folder. I have evidence here of massive financial misconduct committed by Cane Ashby in the last 6 weeks, unauthorized wire transfers, embezzlement of corporate funds to cover up a personal crime of violent assault on Damien Grimaldi. The reporters erupted, shouting questions over one another. Cane Ashby is using Newman Enterprises as his personal piggy bank to stay out of prison, Nick shouted over the din. He is morally bankrupt. And he is dragging this company down with him. And Phyllis Summers, she's complicit. She signed off on the security overrides that allowed these transfers to happen. They are partners in crime. Literally. The flashbulbs blinded him, but Nick didn't blink. He looked straight into the camera, knowing Cane was watching. Checkmate. Adam met the contact in the loading bay of the Newman Tower, junior analyst named Seth, who had been loyal to Victor for years and had managed to keep his job during the purge. Did you get it? Adam asked, his voice a harsh whisper. Seth nodded, handing over a flash drive. It's the internal comms, emails between Cane and his lawyers, and the chats between him and Phyllis. They're panicking. Adam, Phyllis explicitly mentions hiding the money in an email dated yesterday. Adam took the drive, weighing it in his hand. It felt lighter than air, yet it held the weight of a guillotine blade. Good. You'll be rewarded when we take the building back, Seth. For now, keep your head down. Adam walked away, dialing a number on his burner phone. Upload the emails, he commanded. Leak them to the Chronicle, the Inquisitor, and every financial blog in the tri-state area. Make sure the headline reads, Phyllis Summers, the architect of the cover-up. The atmosphere inside Newman Enterprises was apocalyptic. Phones were ringing off the hook, but no one was answering. Staff members were huddled in clumps, whispering, eyeing the executive elevator with fear. Cane sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. The stock price was in freefall. The board had called an emergency meeting without him. The door opened, not with a slam, but with the ominous click of official business. Two men in suits entered, followed by the head of Newman's internal compliance department, a stern woman named Miss Holloway. Mr. Ashby, Holloway said, her voice devoid of emotion. These are independent auditors. Given the severity of the allegations made by Nicholas Newman and the leaked documents regarding your financial conduct, the board has authorized an immediate internal investigation. You can't do this, Cane said, standing up, though his legs felt weak. I am the CEO. I own the majority share. Your shares are frozen pending a federal inquiry into their acquisition and the use of illicit funds, one of the suits said. We need you to step away from the computer, sir. Cane looked at the door. He felt the walls closing in. The phantom pain of the knife in his hand the night he stabbed Damien flared up. He had done it to protect himself, to protect the company, but now the very act was consuming him. Phyllis was in her suite at the Grand Phoenix, frantically packing a bag. She wasn't running. Phyllis Summers never ran, but she needed to be strategic. She needed distance from Cane. She grabbed her phone to call her lawyer, but the screen lit up with a call from Nick. She hesitated, then answered, her voice dripping with false bravado. Here to gloat, Nick. Just giving you a heads up, Red. Nick's voice was cool, detached. The internal audit found your digital fingerprints on the Cayman transfers. You didn't just know about the embezzlement. You facilitated it. I was protecting the company's assets. Phyllis shouted. Cane told me it was a temporary liquidity issue. Cane lied, Nick said. And you were too busy playing queen of the castle to check the books. Or maybe you didn't care. Either way. The DOE is looking at conspiracy charges, accessory to embezzlement, maybe even accessory to attempted murder, if they prove you helped him cover up the stabbing. I had nothing to do with Damien, Phyllis screamed, her hand trembling. Tell it to the cops, Nick said. They're on their way to the Grand Phoenix now. Phyllis dropped the phone. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, she looked truly trapped. The silly alliance with Cane, born out of a mutual hatred for Victor, had turned into a noose. Night had fallen over Genoa City. Cane stood on the balcony of the Newman office, the cold wind biting his face. Below, news vans were circled like vultures. Adam stepped out onto the balcony, the darkness cloaking him. It's a long way down, Cane. Cane spun around. You set me up. You and Nick. You planted the evidence. We didn't have to plant a thing, Adam said, stepping into the light. We just turned on the lights. You did the rest. You stabbed Damien because you're weak. You stole the money because you're greedy. And you dragged Phyllis down because you're selfish. I can fight this, Cane said, though he sounded like a man trying to convince himself. No, you can't, Adam said softly. The board votes in an hour. You're out. The police are downstairs waiting for the audit to finish. Phyllis is likely cutting a deal right now to save her own skin, throwing you to the wolves. Cane gripped the railing. I took this company from your father. I beat him. You held it for a month, Adam corrected, and you lost it because you aren't a Newman. You don't know how to wield power without getting blood on your cuffs. Adam turned to leave. Nick is waiting in the lobby with the authorities. I'd suggest you straighten your tie. It's going to be a long night. As Adam walked away, leaving Cane alone in the freezing wind, the reality of the coup settled in. The partnership was broken. The reputation he had built was in ashes. And somewhere in the dark, The ghost of Damien Grimaldi was laughing.